They locked the monster away forever. He drew it every day. The console had a red cover over it. The cover had a lock. The lock had a chain. The chain had a sign that read, in 7 different languages, 3 of which were not human, "Do not touch." Beneath the sign, someone had taped a smaller sign in cramped handwriting that read, "This means you, Frank." And beneath that, someone else had added a third, in different handwriting, "We are serious this time." Matthew Frank read all 3 signs. He read them the way he read everything, carefully with his head tilt slightly to the left, lips moving just barely, as though the words needed to be tasted before they could be properly understood. Then he pulled out his sketchbook and started drawing the console instead. He drew the lock first, then the chain, then the signs themselves, including the handwriting on the unofficial ones. Because the handwriting told you something about the person who wrote it, and people who wrote things like, "We are serious this time," were people who had been through something they were still processing. He annotated it in the margin. 3rd warning sign. Escalating urgency. Someone has been burned before. "You're not going to touch it," said Velkorath, not looking up from her data screen. Her secondary eyes, the flat amber ones positioned behind her ears, were tracking him anyway. They always were. "I'm drawing it," Matt said. "You drew it yesterday. Different angle. You drew it from 3 angles yesterday. The chain catches the light differently in the morning shift." Velkorath made the sound her species made, instead of sighing. It was like a low-pressure steam valve releasing. A soft, sustained hiss that he had taken, in the early weeks, for a mechanical sound, and had spent 3 embarrassing days trying to locate the source of before Dross had explained it to him. He had put the explanation in the sketchbook too. Everything went in the sketchbook. That was the rule. Matt had been on the Orth research vessel for 11 months, and he still wasn't entirely sure if the sound meant irritation or affection. He had come to believe it was probably both, which was consistent with most of his significant relationships. The Orth were not a militaristic species. They were catalogers, historians, scientists of the patient kind, beings who measured time in geological strata rather than fiscal quarters. They had achieved interstellar travel not through conquest or desperation, but through sheer accumulated patience, one generation building on the last, until eventually they simply had too much knowledge not to use it. They found humanity approximately 40 years ago, concluded that humans were acceleratingly interesting, in the specific way that unpredictable fast-moving systems are into slow-moving systems that prefer predictability, and had been embedding observers on their vessels ever since. Matt Frank was the current observer. He had been selected for the program for a set of reasons that his handlers at the Earth-Orth Exchange Office had explained to him in careful, hedged language that amounted to, "You are the foremost living illustrator of large predatory organisms. You have the security clearance," and several other candidates declined when they learned the assignment details. He was, by any professional measure, exactly the right person. He had 12 published collections of biological illustration, 3 university lecture series that had been described by review panels as provocative, and 1 restraining order from a natural history museum, and had tried to break into at 2 a.m. because he'd heard they had an unmounted specimen of an unreported deep ocean species in cold storage, and he'd wanted to see if his sketches matched. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person you wanted if your research vessel happened to be carrying something in its lower containment deck that nobody was supposed to look at. He had been told on his first day aboard that the lower containment deck was off limits. He had been down there 14 times. He had never touched anything. He had drawn everything. "The readings from Containment 7 are elevated again," said Dross, the ship's second navigator, from across the bridge. Dross was younger than Velkorath, and had not yet developed the practiced stillness of the older Orth, the quality that made them look, to human eyes, like extremely attentive statues. His primary tendrils moved when he was nervous. They were moving now, curling slightly at the tips, which Matt had learned to read the way you learn to read weather. 3rd time this week. The dampener field is showing fluctuations in the secondary harmonic range. "Lock it and reduce the dampener output by 0.2, Velkorath said. "If we reduce the dampener field." "I know what happens if we reduce the dampener field, Dross." Her voice was precisely calibrated, the particular flatness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence until all the anxiety has been pressed out of it, leaving only the words. "But if we don't reduce it, the field generator overloads under the stress, and then we have a considerably larger problem on a considerably shorter timeline." Matt looked up from the sketchbook. He had been adding shading to the chain links. What's in 7? That information is not relevant to your research brief. I've heard it moving. You've heard the ship's mechanical systems. The resonance in the lower hull is a known structural characteristic. At 3 a.m. 4 nights ago, I heard something that sounded like tectonic plates negotiating a disagreement. And then all the instruments on Deck 4 went dark for 6 minutes. He turned the sketchbook around. On the page was a drawing, large, complex, built from angles and inferences rather than direct observation. I drew what I thought it might look like based on the acoustic signature and the thermal differential I measured through the hull plating. Velkorath finally looked at the drawing. Her secondary eyes went very still. Her primary eyes, the large gold ones in front, which ordinarily tracked with a slow, deliberate quality like remote telescope arrays choosing their focus, blinked once slowly, which he had identified as the Orith equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "That is a remarkable imagination," she said, after a moment that was slightly too long to be casual. "That's what the drawing looks like, based on the acoustic patterns, the thermal signature, and the electromagnetic distortion in the lower hull that you can detect if you build the right kind of scanner from medical equipment components." Matthew. Very flat. "You built a scanner, informally. From the medical bay equipment. The regulations specified I couldn't use the equipment for medical purposes without supervision. They were ambiguous about diagnostic instruments. You're telling me you read the medical bay equipment regulations closely enough to find an ambiguity?" I read everything closely. He turned the sketchbook back toward himself and continued shading. "I'm placing a formal notation in my own file about the scanner, just to keep things consistent." She made the steam valve sound, longer this time. Dross's tendrils had stilled while they were talking, and were starting to move again, which meant the conversation had not reassured him about the Containment 7 situation. Matt filed that away. The thing that Matt did not say, sitting there with his sketchbook in the amber emergency light of an elevated reading from the deck below, was that he had known what was in Containment 7 since month 2. He had suspected it in month 1. By month 2, after his third unauthorized trip to the lower deck and his first set of acoustic measurements, he had been certain enough to start revising drawings he'd made from imagination into drawings with the word "confirmed" written in the margin. He did not say this because he was not sure yet what the right time to say it was. He had a theory about information developed over 26 years of studying things that were larger and stranger than most people were comfortable with. Information announced before its time becomes a wall. Information offered at the right moment becomes a door. He was still waiting for the right moment. In the meantime, he drew. The incident happened on a Tuesday. Matt had always had a complicated relationship with Tuesdays. They were statistically, in his experience, the most likely day for consequential things to happen, which ran counter to every cultural assumption about Mondays, and suggested either a personal anomaly or a universe with a dry sense of humor. His first published illustration, Tuesday, the museum incident, Tuesday, the moment his first xenobiology paper was accepted, the one that the journal's editorial board had initially described as speculative to the point of irresponsibility, and then accepted 3 months later when a deep ocean survey team produced physical evidence that confirmed his speculations. Tuesday, he was running a calibration check on the bridge environmental systems, a task that had been assigned to him specifically to keep him occupied, and at a known location, and which he had completed in 22 minutes rather than the scheduled 4 hours, because the calibration protocol was straightforward once you understood the underlying system logic, which he'd studied from the technical manual during his second week aboard. He was using the remaining 3 hours and 38 minutes to refine his frequency charts in the margin of the sketchbook when the alert klaxon sounded, not the slow cycling alarm that meant a routine system fault, not the 3-tone pattern that meant a navigation anomaly or a solar weather event. The fast one, the continuous urgent tone that cut through thought and made Dross's tendrils flatten completely against his body, and made Velkorath stand up from her chair. In 11 months, Matt had never seen her stand up from her chair for an alarm. "Containment breach in progress," said the ship's automated system, in that specific calibrated tone that automated systems use when they are describing something catastrophic in the most neutral possible language, and which instead causes more alarm, precisely because the neutrality is so visibly working hard. "Dampener field failure imminent. All personnel report to emergency positions." "What is the breach timeline?" Velkorath said. Her voice matched the ship's automation almost exactly, Not frightened, but working very hard. Field integrity at 41% and falling. Estimated complete field failure. 9 minutes, 20 seconds. Dross was already moving to the emergency console, the one with the red cover and the lock and the chain and the 3 signs. His tendrils were cycling through the unlocking sequence with the practiced speed of someone who had drilled this many times and hoped to never use the drill. Matt set the sketchbook down on the navigation platform, next to the drawings he'd been refining. He stood up. "The emergency release," he said. "Walk me through what it does." "It activates the secondary containment system." Velkorath was pulling on an emergency harness with the focus of someone in a drill, not showing her hands the work but letting muscle memory do it. The secondary system has an estimated hold duration of 4 minutes under these stress conditions. After that, we proceed to the deep space ejection protocol, which is, we open the lower deck hatches. The containment chamber vents to space. She met his eyes directly, which the Orcs only did when they were being deliberately honest. The subject will survive the vacuum exposure and the transition. It has done so before, according to the historical record. We will not survive what happens after it is no longer contained and is no longer in space. Matt looked at the console, at the timer now showing 9 minutes 6 seconds, at Dross's tendrils which had flattened in the unlocking sequence and were trying not to tremble, at his sketchbook, open on the navigation platform to the latest frequency chart, the one he'd been refining for 3 weeks, the one that had finally started to tell him something he'd suspected since month 4, and only recently had enough data to say with confidence. "There is a third option," he said. "Matthew, very quiet. The particular quiet of someone who does not have time for the wrong conversation. There is no third option. The dampener field is generating the breach itself. The subject is not trying to escape, it's in distress. The field modulation is hitting a specific frequency range that's equivalent to an aversive stimulus. It's been escalating for 3 months because the field generator has been drifting, and every adjustment you've made has accidentally pushed closer to the aversive range." He had his sketchbook now, turning to the frequency charts. "Look at the incident log. The spikes correlate with field modulator calibration events. You've been trying to strengthen the field, and you've been accidentally making the situation worse every time." The silence from Velkorath was a different quality than her usual silences. It was the silence of someone recalibrating. "You have been tracking the incident log," she said, informally, in the margins. Dross had the cover off the emergency console. His tendrils were hovering over the controls, waiting. He looked at Velkorath. The timer read 8 minutes 40 seconds. "The modulator control," Matt said. He moved to the console, not touching it, standing beside Dross. "If you shift the primary harmonic frequency down by approximately 14 Hz, I have the exact figure here, you move out of the aversive range. The field strength actually increases when you get the frequency right, because you stop fighting the subject's own electromagnetic field instead of trying to overpower it. Like tuning a radio. You don't need more power, you need the right signal." "The calculated adjustment," Velkorath said slowly, "is on a console that is locked under emergency protocols." "Yes, for the specific reason that an incorrect adjustment would accelerate the breach. An incorrect adjustment would. This one won't." "You're certain?" "I've been modeling this scenario for 6 weeks. He held up the sketchbook. The margins of the frequency charts were dense with calculations in his cramped notation, columns of figures running alongside the acoustic and thermal data, converging on a single number highlighted in the lower right corner of the page. 14.3 Hz. I've run the model 47 times. The result is consistent." "In a handwritten sketchbook," Velkorath said, "the math is the same in any medium. 8 minutes 14 seconds. She looked at the sketchbook. She looked at the timer. She looked at Dross, whose tendrils had gone very still. The stillness of someone who has just realized that the choice has already effectively been made and is waiting for the adults to catch up with it. She looked at Matt. He looked back. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing calm. He didn't have enough distance from the situation for that. He was just there, the way he was always there when something needed to be looked at carefully and directly, without flinching. "Matthew," she said, and his name in her voice had all the accumulated weight of 11 months of formal notations, and confiscated scanners and unauthorized lower deck visits, and margins full of calculations that nobody had asked him to make. "If you are wrong, I know. If the adjustment accelerates the breach, I know what happens." His voice was steady, not loud, not dramatic. The same voice he'd used the time a junior crew member's suit had started to breach during an external maintenance check, and Matt had talked her through the repair procedure from memory over the comm system, step by step for 14 minutes. Because he'd read the suit maintenance manual in his first week aboard, because you read things in case you need them. I've spent 26 years on this. I am not wrong. She looked at him for one more second. 2 seconds. The timer moved. Then she stepped aside. He crossed to the console. He pulled the sketchbook open flat, holding it in his left hand. With his right hand he worked through the interface the way Dross had shown him during his 3rd week aboard. Not officially, just because Dross was young and curious and liked explaining things. And Matt was the kind of person who listened when things were explained to him. He found the modulator array. The frequency displays was cycling through the pattern he'd been charting for 3 months. The ugly oscillation of a system that had been drifting toward the wrong range for so long that it had started to feel normal. He adjusted it step by step, not all at once, not the way an engineer would push a system to its new setting, the way you approach something alive, carefully, giving it time to understand that the change was not an attack. "Don't touch the blue secondary controls," Dross said very quietly from just behind his shoulder. "I wasn't going to touch the blue controls. You were looking at them quite intently. I was noting their position for future reference. It's different." The sounds from the lower deck shifted. Not cut off, not silenced, but changed in quality, the way a wind changes when it moves from fighting a structure to moving around it. The massive subsonic grinding that had been building for 9 minutes reduced, in the space of about 40 seconds, to a lower frequency entirely. Something Matt had charted before, something he recognized. The sound the thing in Containment 7 made when it was doing what he had started, privately, to call the Long Watch. The slow, ancient pacing of a deep ocean creature moving through a space much smaller than it was built for, but moving in a rhythm that was, at minimum, not distressed. Field integrity stabilizing, the ship's system said. The automated flatness now carried what Matt imagined was a slight quality of relief, which was almost certainly him projecting. 47%, 52, 59. Field integrity at 61% and holding. Dross made a sound Matt had never heard from him before. A low, sustained harmonic that he filed away as the Orth equivalent of a breath held under enormous pressure finally and completely released. He would draw it later. He drew everything eventually. Velkorath stood behind Matt and looked at the frequency display. Now running smooth. Now sitting at the corrected harmonic. Now functioning the way it would have been functioning for the last 3 months, if anyone had known to look at the problem from this particular angle. She looked for a long time. "You have known what it is since month 2, she said. Not a question. "Since month 2, he confirmed. "You built instruments, you mapped the incidents. You modeled the breach scenario. You calculated the correction." She was still looking at the display. "And you said nothing. I needed more data." He closed the sketchbook. "And I wasn't sure what telling you would do. I've been in rooms before where knowing the right thing doesn't help if the people with authority need more time to catch up to it." "The museum incident," she said, and the sound valve made a brief appearance. Different situation but similar principle. He set the sketchbook on the console edge. "Also, I wanted more drawings." She finally turned to look at him directly, all 4 eyes, primary and secondary both. "Matthew, this will require a formal inquiry." "I expect so. You will be required to explain the unauthorized scanning equipment, the lower deck visits, the incident log documentation, the frequency modeling. I have everything documented. It's in the sketchbook." He picked it up again. 11 months of it, annotated. She looked at the sketchbook. He could see her working through several different responses simultaneously, the way the Orth did when a situation exceeded the existing categories they'd prepared for it. Finally, she said, "The formal notation I am placing in your file for this incident will be considerably longer than any previous notation. I'll frame it," he said, "alongside the others." The formal inquiry took 3 days and 7 hours of testimony in front of Science Council representatives, transmitted in via holographic relay from the nearest sector station. They were an audience of professional skeptics, beings whose entire career structure was built around the documentation and verification of things that other people had gotten wrong. And they brought to the proceedings the specific energy of people who have been deeply unsettled by events, and are responding by being extremely thorough about everything, except the part that unsettled them. Matt explained the frequency mapping first, then the acoustic analysis methodology, with the original measurement logs cross-referenced against the ship's official incident reports, which he had not had official access to, and which he had obtained by asking Dross to read them to him out loud over meals, which technically did not constitute unauthorized data access. Dross, when this was noted, made a sound that was either protest or laughter. Given the context, probably both. He showed the frequency chart models. He walked through the breach scenario calculation at the council's request, then walked through it again when a senior representative wanted to challenge the thermal differential assumptions, and then walked through it a third time when the same representative concluded that the thermal differential assumptions were sound and wanted to understand the acoustic modeling instead. He was patient about this. Patience was, in his experience, the only reliable tool for situations where you knew the right answer and needed the room to arrive at it independently. On the second day, a council member asked about the lower deck visits. Matt described them in full, including dates, duration, methods of entry. The access panel in the secondary engineering corridor had a 17-second delay in the lock cycle during shift changes, a timing detail he had identified on his third week and which no one had corrected in 11 months, which he considered a systems management concern worth noting in his testimony, and everything he had observed during each visit. He described the acoustic environment of the lower deck. He described the light conditions. He described the electromagnetic distortion that prickled at the back of his neck each time, which he had confirmed using the scanner, and which he had also confirmed using the older, less reliable instrument of standing still and paying attention. He showed the drawings, all 17 of the primary observational studies, the anatomical revision sets, the behavioral notation sketches. The series he'd titled The Long Watch in the sketchbook's internal index, which showed the slow circuit of the thing in Containment 7 over time. Not one drawing, but a sequence of them, each slightly different, documenting the changes in movement pattern that corresponded, in his analysis, to changes in the dampener field frequency. This was the clearest evidence for his breach model, and he knew it, and he watched the council recognize it one representative at a time, which was the most satisfying kind of watching. On the third day, Velkorath brought him the preliminary findings on a data tablet and sat across from him in the small conference room that smelled like recycled air, and the mineral compound the ship's systems used for hull maintenance. He read the document. Then he read it again more slowly, which was his habit. When a document contained something he wanted to be sure he had understood correctly. They want to continue the research program, he said. Adapted and expanded, Velkorath said carefully, under proper scientific oversight and with a full ethical review of the containment conditions, using my methodology as the foundation, with significant additions from the Council's own xenobiology team. Yes, and the subject. That is the matter, so would like your input on. She folded her primary appendages, which was the Orth gesture for approaching a conversation with particular care. There are several positions being advocated. Some members believe that the appropriate response is enhanced containment and continued study under the current classification. Others believe the breach incident demonstrates that current containment philosophy is fundamentally inadequate and that the subject should be relocated to a larger facility designed specifically for its requirements. Matt set the tablet down. He looked at the table surface for a moment, which was what he did instead of looking at the window when there was no window available. What's the third position, he said. There is not an official third position. There's always a third position. He looked up. What do the members who are uncomfortable with both of those options want? Velkorath looked at him with all four eyes again. They want to know what you think. He was quiet for a while, long enough that Velkorath, who was comfortable with long silences in a way that very few humans were, did not fill it. I have conditions, he said finally. You have conditions, she repeated. 3 of them. And they're not negotiable, which I understand is not how this process typically works. But I think the Council is in a position where not negotiating is more expensive than the alternative. She considered this. Go ahead. First, full research designation. Not observer, not consultant, not informally affiliated. My name on the methodology, my name on the studies, full academic credit and research standing with the Orth Science Council. I've earned it and we both know it. That is unusual for a human exchange participant, but not impossible. A pause. Continue. Second, a proper workspace. I've been drawing on the floor of a 4-square-meter bunk for 11 months. I need a studio space with adequate surface area, proper lighting, and storage for materials. This is not a luxury request. The drawings are the research. Also reasonable. The council will agree to that without difficulty. She tilted her head slightly. And the third? He looked back at the table. When he looked up again, his voice was in that quiet register. Not soft, not performing softness, just direct and completely without room in it for argument. The ejection protocol is removed from the contingency plan. Permanently. Whatever containment facility is built, you build it to hold. You bring me in on the design so the frequency environment is correct from the beginning. You staff it with people who understand that this creature is not a weapon, and not a disaster waiting to happen, and not a problem to be managed. It is the oldest living thing that we have confirmed exists in this sector of the galaxy. It was alive when the first human looked at the sky and wondered what was out there. We do not have the right to treat it like a liability on a balance sheet, and I will not lend my work to any program that maintains that as a fallback option. The recycled air moved through the room. Somewhere in the ship's lower structure, faint but unmistakable to anyone who had learned to listen for it, the thing in Containment 7 made the low, resonant sound of deep water, finding its level. All three conditions, Velkorath said. All three. I will present them to the council. She stood, which meant the formal portion of the conversation was over. Then she paused, which meant it wasn't quite. Matthew, there is something I should have told you at the beginning of your assignment, and which I am telling you now, because the situation has changed enough that withholding it is no longer appropriate. She chose her words with the Orth's characteristic precision, each one placed where it was meant to land. You were not selected for this program primarily because of your illustration credentials. You were selected because the council reviewed your entire professional history and identified something in the methodology that they had not encountered before, not in the knowledge itself, but in the way you hold knowledge. He waited. Other species accumulate data efficiently. Some exceed human capacity considerably. But what the council identified in your work, in the papers, the lecture records, even the museum incident report, which they found particularly illustrative, was a quality of investment. Every piece of research you have done carries the mark of someone who is not just studying a subject but caring about it, who is not just trying to be right but trying to understand. The council had a hypothesis that this quality, which is remarkably rare in their experience, and which they observe more consistently in humans than in most species they have studied, might produce results in proximity to the subject in 7 that purely technical approaches had failed to produce. She looked at the sketchbook in his hand. The results have confirmed the hypothesis. Matt sat with this for a moment. 26 years of people telling him he was too invested, too emotional, too personally attached to his subjects to be a rigorous scientist. 26 years of publishing anyway, and being right anyway, and standing at enough lecterns in enough rooms full of skeptical faces to know that caring about something and knowing it carefully were not opposites, but, at their best, the same thing wearing different names. You put me near it on purpose, he said. We arranged the conditions. The results were yours. And you didn't tell me what was in 7 because we believed, based on your profile, that knowing would change the way you approached it. The council wanted to observe natural behavior. A pause that he thought might be, in Orth terms, an apology. It was ethically complicated. I was not entirely comfortable with it. Did it work? She made the steam valve sound, very brief, and in a key he had come to associate with something that was not quite a smile. You adjusted the dampener frequency to match a blue whale song and prevented a galactic-scale containment breach with 11 months of unauthorized research and a pencil drawing, she said. I would characterize the results as affirmative. He looked down at the sketchbook. He turned to the page he'd been working on in the 3 days of the inquiry. Drawing from memory rather than observation. Doing the anatomical revision he'd been planning since the observation window was first mentioned. Trying to get the dorsal ridge structure right, which was harder from acoustics than it looked. He still wasn't satisfied with it. I need the observation window, he said. The formal one, soon. It is being arranged. I need my good pencils. The set in my secondary kit. The kit you were not authorized to bring aboard. The equipment restrictions were ambiguous. She made the sound again, longer this time, more sustained. He was now certain that it was affection. He had been certain for 4 months, but it was good to have confirmation. The formal research program was designated 8 months later. The expanded containment facility, built to Matt's acoustic and environmental specifications, took 14 months after that. The studio space they gave him was 3 times the size of his old bunk, and had proper northern light simulation and wall-mounted storage for the 19 sketchbooks he had now filled. He thought about framing the formal notations from his file above the drawing table, but decided instead to leave the walls clear for reference material and post the notations somewhere he'd see them daily. He put them on the inside of the studio door. Entry-level reminder, you are still technically on probation. The first peer-reviewed paper ran 47 pages. The second was 62. The third, which attracted enough attention that Matt spent 6 weeks on tour to 3 different research institutions and 2 interstellar academies, was the one that contained the blue whale frequency connection. The correlation between the lowest acoustic register of the largest Earth-ocean organism and the primary calming harmonic of the oldest confirmed living entity in Sector 7. The paper had 4 pages of illustration in the supplementary material, rendered with the precision of someone who had spent 26 years getting the proportions as close to right as the available evidence allowed. He stood at the lectern for the third paper's presentation and looked out at the most concentrated audience of credentials he had ever been in front of. 11 species, most of them with more formal training than he'd ever accumulated. All of them having read the paper in advance and most of them ready to find the flaw. He was not comfortable at lecterns. He was built for smaller rooms, for the desk in the studio and the floor of the observation platform and the 40-minute focused silences that produced one perfect drawing. But he had stood at enough lecterns to know that discomfort at a lectern looks a great deal like conviction, and conviction was what the room needed. He walked them through the frequency correlation first, then the behavioral data, the shift in movement patterns that corresponded to the corrected harmonic environment, the measurable reduction in what the Orcs classification system called stress indicators, but which Matt's paper argued were better understood as responses to an inadequate sensory environment. He used the word inadequate deliberately, and in the 3 seconds of silence that followed, he watched the room absorb the implication that the creature had been in distress, not because it was dangerous, but because it was in pain. A senior academic from the Orcs Historical Archive Division, so old that she communicated partly through annotated copies of documents her predecessors had written, creating a kind of layered textual conversation with the past that Matt found genuinely beautiful, raised an appendage. The blue whale correlation, she said. How did you make the connection? A paper published by an Earth marine biologist 40 years ago. She had noted acoustic similarities between large Earth pelagic organisms and certain Orcs xenobiology catalog entries, and filed the observation without follow-up because the distances and classification differences made further comparison seem impractical. He looked out at the room. I read it when I was 19. I remembered it when I was doing the frequency modeling. You retained a detail from a 40-year-old paper. I find large organisms interesting, he said. I tend to remember details about them. The Orcs academic looked at him for a moment. Then she made the steam valve sound, which Matt had learned, in the 14 months since the breach incident, was not specific to Velkorath, but was in fact a fairly common Orcs expression, produced slightly differently by each individual in ways that, once you knew what to listen for, were as distinct as fingerprints. The paper's methodology, she said, rests substantially on observational data that was collected without authorization under conditions that would not pass current ethical review. Yes, Matt said. You acknowledge this, fully. I think the ethical review process needs updating. The current framework assumes that unauthorized access is inherently reckless, and doesn't have good language for cases where the unauthorized observer is the most qualified person in proximity, and the authorized observers are missing something consequential. He paused. I put that in the discussion section, page 41. Another steam valve sound, this one with the particular quality he had come to identify as involuntary, which was the most satisfying kind. 2 seats to the left of the old Orcs academic, a young human researcher who had been brought as a liaison from the Earth-Orcs Exchange Office, laughed openly, then looked alarmed at herself, then laughed again when she realized that was apparently acceptable in this room. He went back to the ship. He always went back to the ship. It was at this point more his than any place on Earth had ever managed to be, not because it was comfortable, exactly, but because the most important thing was here, in the lower deck, and he could not imagine being far from it for very long. The observation sessions were now formal, logged, and scheduled, a compromise between what Matt wanted, unrestricted access, and what the Council's ethical framework allowed, structured and supervised. He had negotiated the schedule down from monthly to weekly, and then from weekly to 3 times a week, on the grounds that the behavioral dataset improved nonlinearly with observation frequency, and that the drawings required consistency of light and environmental conditions to be scientifically reliable. Velkorath had presented this argument to the council on his behalf, which she had technically not been required to do. She had used the phrase, "Observational methodology requires iterative refinement," which was accurate, and also the phrase, "The human becomes agitated when separated from the subject for extended periods," which was also accurate, and which Matt had not known she'd noticed. He sat on the observation platform on a Tuesday, sketchbook open, pencils laid out in the order he used them. The containment space had been rebuilt to the new specifications, larger, better calibrated, with the primary harmonic running clean at the corrected frequency, so that the whole environment had a quality that Matt's instruments measured as stable, and that his body, sitting in front of the observation glass, registered as something he had given up trying to name with precision. Not peace exactly, presence, the feeling of being in the same room as something that has always existed and will keep existing, and the strange gift of getting to be, for a little while, the one who noticed. The creature made its slow circuit. Not the agitated grinding of the breach incident, not the compressed distress of 11 months of inadequate frequency calibration. The long watch, the ancient patient movement of something that has outlasted every event in recorded history and does not distinguish between urgency and waiting, because at its scale, they are the same thing. It turned at the far end of the containment space. It looked at him. Matt looked back. He had been looking at this thing for 26 years. In old library photographs and misidentified fossil records and ancient carvings, and the particular quality of fear that runs through every culture that has ever lived near a large ocean. He had drawn it from imagination, from inference, from acoustic signature and thermal differential and unauthorized scanner data. He had drawn it from this exact spot in this chair 3 times a week for 14 months. He still didn't have it exactly right. The scale defeated him, not because he couldn't render large things, but because large was a relative term, and this thing existed at a register where relative terms stopped functioning. Every drawing got closer, none of them arrived. He turned to a new page. Dross appeared at his shoulder after a while, carrying 2 cups of the heated liquid that had been synthesized specifically for Matt's use after month 3. Not tea, but close enough in temperature and quality of warmth that the distinction no longer troubled him. Dross set 1 cup beside Sketch and stood out there for a moment watching the creature's slow circuit. "The council confirmed your 3rd condition," Dross said. "The formal revision to the contingency framework was approved this morning. The ejection protocol has been removed from the contingency plan. It does not exist as an option in the new facility documentation." Matt looked up from the page. "Velkorath argued for it personally," Dross added. "At the 3rd council session, there was significant opposition from the security division. She argued for 2 hours. Matt looked back at the containment space. At the creature completing its turn at the far end of the space beginning the circuit back. At the eye briefly visible, ancient and gold and catching the adjusted light. "Good," he said. He picked up his pencil. He looked at the dorsal ridge structure, the part he still hadn't resolved to his satisfaction. The line of it more complex than any previous drawing had captured, layered in ways that suggested not just anatomy but history. Each ridge a record of something survived. He began to draw. Outside the ship 11 light minutes in every direction, the stars maintained their usual position on the question of what mattered. The heated cup went warm in the recycled air. Dross stood beside him for a few minutes, watching, and then quietly left. Velkorath appeared briefly at the platform entrance, noted the sketchbook and the pencil, and the full stillness of a person who has arrived after 26 years of trying, at something close to the center of what they were made for, and withdrew without speaking. The creature reached the near end of its circuit. It did not look at him every pass. Sometimes it looked, sometimes it didn't, and Matt had decided that this variability was not indifference, but something more interesting. The variable attention of a being that had its own occupations and concerns, and ancient ongoing considerations, and which had simply, over the course of 14 months of 3 times weekly presence, and corrected frequency environments, and the particular quality of attention that was too complete to be called study and too patient to be called love, but was probably both, decided that he was part of the room. He had 11 more sketchbooks in the storage cabinet. He intended to fill all of them. He intended to fill them slowly, carefully from the right angles, returning to earlier drawings and revising when the new evidence required it, building a record of something so large and old and extraordinary that the only possible response to it was exactly this: to sit still and look and draw and keep drawing until the proportions were finally right. He thought they probably never would be. He thought he would keep trying anyway. That was, in the end, what it meant to be human. Not the cleverness, not the stubbornness, not the willingness to press buttons that had 3 signs on them saying not to. All of that was real. But underneath all of it, deeper than the 12 publications and the unauthorized scanner and the frequency chart that had saved the ship, the specific, incurable human tendency to find something larger than yourself in the universe and refuse, in the face of every sensible argument, to stop looking at it. The pencil moved, the page filled, the creature made its ancient circuit. The stars continued to exist at enormous distances with complete indifference to the small dramas of the beings who sailed between them, and Matthew Frank continued, as he always had, to find that comforting.